The girl they found wandering the burned remains of the Apache settlement had eyes like shattered glass, reflecting nothing but emptiness. Martha Henley, the widow who took her in, would later say that it was not the child's silence that haunted her most, but the way she seemed to recognize things no white child should know. The authorities called it trauma, but Martha knew better. This girl carried secrets that would either heal two broken souls or destroy the fragile peace that had settled over Cedar Ridge after 3 years of bloody conflict with the Apache tribes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Arizona territory, as Sheriff Tom Bradley rode slowly toward the cluster of buildings that marked the heart of their small frontier town. It was September 1887, and the air carried the crisp promise of autumn, though the desert heat still clung to the earth like a stubborn memory. Behind him, wrapped in a tattered cavalry blanket, sat the most peculiar discovery of his 20-year career in law enforcement. The girl could not have been more than 12 years old, with tangled auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire and skin bronzed by desert sun. She had been found 3 days prior by a cavalry patrol investigating smoke signals reported by local ranchers. What they discovered defied explanation. An Apache camp reduced to smoldering ash, bodies scattered like broken dolls, and in the center of it all, this white child sitting cross-legged beside the remains of a fire that had long since died. She had not spoken a single word since they found her. Not when Captain Morrison tried questioning her in English, not when the Mexican scout attempted Spanish, and certainly not when Old Two Bears, the Navajo tracker, tried his handful of Apache phrases. She simply stared with those haunting green eyes, as if she were looking through people rather than at them, seeing something the rest of them could not comprehend. Sheriff Bradley pulled his horse to a stop outside Martha Henley's boarding house, a 2-story structure that had seen better days, but still maintained the dignity of careful upkeep. Paint peeled from the wooden siding like old skin, and the porch sagged slightly under the weight of years, but the windows gleamed clean and bright geraniums bloomed in carefully tended boxes beneath each sill. Martha emerged before he could dismount, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 43, she carried herself with the particular grace of a woman who had learned to bear loss without allowing it to break her. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun, and her brown eyes held the kind of warmth that came from understanding suffering firsthand. "Sheriff Bradley," she called, her voice carrying the slight accent of her Missouri upbringing. "I heard about what happened out at the settlement. How is the child?" Tom Bradley was a man of few words, carved from the same hard stone as the desert mountains that surrounded their town. His weathered face told the story of 30 years on the frontier, first as a cavalry officer and then as keeper of the peace in this corner of civilization that seemed perpetually balanced on the edge of chaos. "That's what I'm hoping you can help me figure out, Martha," he replied, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested each morning's ride. "She hasn't said a word, won't eat much, just sits and stares like she's seeing ghosts." The girl remained motionless on the horse, her small hands gripping the blanket as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. Martha approached slowly, her footsteps soft on the packed earth of the street. Something in the child's posture reminded her of a wild animal, alert and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Martha asked gently, reaching up to help the girl down from the horse. The child's eyes met hers for just a moment, and Martha felt a jolt of recognition that made no sense. There was something familiar in that gaze, something that stirred memories she thought she had buried with her husband and son. The girl allowed herself to be lifted down, but immediately stepped back, maintaining distance like a careful negotiation between fear and necessity. She was smaller than Martha had expected, thin in the way of children who had known hunger. But there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of survival against impossible odds. "The Apache called her Little Wolf," Sheriff Bradley said, lowering his voice. "At least that's what Two Bears thinks he heard before everything went to hell out there." But she's white, Martha, no question about that. Red hair, green eyes, freckles across her nose. Someone's daughter, lost God knows how long ago. Martha nodded, studying the child's face. The girl's features were delicate but marked by exposure to sun and wind. Her clothes were a mixture of Apache and white styles, a cotton dress that had once been blue but was now faded to the color of old denim, worn over deerskin leggings that showed the careful workmanship of Indian hands. Around her neck hung a small pouch made of soft leather, decorated with beadwork in patterns that Martha did not recognize. "How long do you think she was with them?" Martha asked. "Hard to say. Could be months, could be years. The way she moves, the way she watches everything." Bradley shook his head. "She's learned their ways, that's certain. Question is whether she remembers anything from before." The three of them stood in the growing heat of the morning, an unlikely tableau that would be remembered by the handful of townspeople who witnessed it. Martha Henley, the widow who had lost everything in an Apache raid 3 years prior, Sheriff Tom Bradley, the lawman who had spent his career trying to keep peace between two worlds that seemed destined for conflict, and the silent child who somehow belonged to both and neither. "I'll take her," Martha said finally, the words surprising even herself. She had sworn off caring for anyone after burying her family, had built walls around her heart that she thought were impenetrable. But something about this lost girl called to the mother in her that she thought had died with her son. "Martha, you sure about this? We don't know what she's been through, what she might have seen. These Apache raids." Bradley's voice trailed off. He knew Martha's story, knew the scars that the Indian Wars had left on her soul. "I'm sure," Martha replied, though her voice carried a tremor that suggested otherwise. "She needs someone who understands. And maybe—" She paused, looking down at the girl who stood so still and watchful. "Maybe I need someone who understands, too." The girl tilted her head slightly, as if she had caught some meaning in Martha's words that transcended language. For just a moment, the mask of careful emptiness slipped from her features, and Martha glimpsed something that made her heart clench with recognition, the look of a soul that had learned to survive by forgetting how to hope. Sheriff Bradley removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. The badge on his vest caught the sunlight, a small star of authority in a land where authority often meant little more than the speed of one's draw and the accuracy of one's aim. "There's something else, Martha. Something I haven't told you yet." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The patrol that found her. They said the Apache settlement looked like it had been attacked, but not by cavalry. No horse tracks, no boot prints. The bodies—" He glanced at the child, then back to Martha. "They were killed with Apache weapons. Arrows, knives, tomahawks, like they'd been fighting their own people." Martha felt a chill, despite the growing heat of the day. What are you saying, Tom?" "I'm saying maybe this little girl saw something that could get her killed if the wrong people find out she's alive. Maybe someone wanted to make sure there were no witnesses to whatever happened out there." The implications hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. In the 3 years since the Great Apache Uprising had been officially ended, an uneasy peace had settled over the territory. But peace was a fragile thing in this land, built on treaties that both sides knew were written in sand rather than stone. Martha looked down at the girl, who was now watching a hawk circle high overhead. There was something in the child's posture, a tension that suggested she understood more than her silence revealed. Martha had seen that same alertness in wild animals, the constant readiness for flight or fight that came from living always on the edge of danger. "What's her real name?" Martha asked. "Someone, somewhere, is missing this child." "That's just it," Bradley replied. "We've checked every report of missing children for the past 5 years. Nothing matches. No families come forward. No one's claimed her. It's like she appeared out of thin air." The girl suddenly turned toward them, her green eyes focusing with startling intensity on Sheriff Bradley's face. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing directly in front of him. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up and touched the star-shaped badge on his vest. "Star," she whispered, the single word falling into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. It was the first word anyone had heard her speak, and it hit both adults with the force of revelation. Her voice was soft, almost musical, but there was something in her pronunciation that suggested English was not the only language she knew. "That's right, sweetheart," Martha said gently, kneeling down to the child's level. "That's a star. Do you know what stars are for?" The girl looked at Martha with those unsettling green eyes, and for a moment, Martha felt as if she were being evaluated by something far older and wiser than a 12-year-old child should be. "Stars show the way home," the girl said, her voice gaining strength. "But some people don't want to go home." The words carried a weight that made both adults uncomfortable. There was too much knowledge in that young voice, too much understanding of things that children should not have to comprehend. Martha stood slowly, her mind racing. The girl was clearly more aware of her surroundings than she had initially let on. The silence had been a choice, not an inability. That raised troubling questions about what she might have witnessed and why she had chosen to remain mute until now. "Would you like to come inside?" Martha asked. "I have fresh bread in the oven, and there's a room upstairs where you can rest." The girl nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the sheriff's badge. "The Star Men came to our camp before," she said quietly. "They said they were friends, but friends don't lie." Sheriff Bradley and Martha exchanged glances. The child's words suggested a sophistication of understanding that was both remarkable and disturbing. She was clearly capable of complex thought and communication, which made her previous silence all the more significant. "What happened to your camp?" Bradley asked gently, crouching down to the girl's eye level. "Can you tell us what you saw?" The girl's face closed off immediately, the brief openness disappearing behind walls of carefully constructed emptiness. She shook her head and stepped back, closer to Martha, as if seeking protection from the sheriff's questions. "Not now, Tom," Martha said firmly. "She needs time. She needs to feel safe." Martha placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, feeling the tension in those small muscles. The child did not pull away, but neither did she relax into the touch. It was another careful negotiation, another test of trust in a world where trust had proven to be a dangerous luxury. "Come on, sweetheart," Martha said. "Let's get you something to eat and a place to rest. The questions can wait." As they walked toward the boarding house, Martha caught sight of faces peering out from windows and doorways. News traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Ridge, and the arrival of a mysterious child found at the site of an Apache massacre would be the subject of speculation and gossip for weeks to come. The boarding house interior was cool and dim after the bright sunlight of the street. Martha had decorated it with the care of a woman who understood that small comforts could mean the difference between mere survival and actually living. Crocheted doilies covered small tables, wildflowers gathered from the desert bloomed in mason jars, and the walls displayed a few precious photographs brought from Missouri before the Troubles began. The girl stopped just inside the doorway, her head tilted as if listening to sounds that no one else could hear. Martha watched her carefully, noting the way the child's eyes darted to each window and door, mapping escape routes with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had learned that staying alive meant always knowing how to run. "Are you hungry?" Martha asked, leading the way toward the kitchen. The girl followed at a careful distance, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. The kitchen was Martha's pride, a clean and well-organized space that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Sunlight streamed through gingham curtains, casting cheerful patterns on the scrubbed pine table. It was a room designed for family meals and comfortable conversation, though it had been many years since Martha had enjoyed either. The girl stood in the doorway, clearly overwhelmed by the abundance of civilization after whatever privations she had endured. Her eyes lingered on the cast-iron stove, the shelves lined with preserves and dry goods, the pump handle that brought clean water with just a few strokes. "Sit down," Martha said gently, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "I'll fix you something to eat." The girl remained standing, her wariness returning in full force. Martha realized that the simple act of sitting at a table might be foreign to her after living with the Apache, who traditionally ate seated on the ground around communal fires. "It's all right," Martha said, sitting down herself to appear less threatening. "You can stand if you prefer, or sit on the floor, whatever makes you comfortable." The girl considered this for a moment, then slowly lowered herself to sit cross-legged on the kitchen floor, her back against the wall where she could see all entrances and exits. It was a position that spoke of hard-learned lessons about survival and the importance of never being caught off guard. Martha cut thick slices of bread still warm from the oven and spread them with butter and wild honey. She placed the plate on the floor beside the girl, along with a cup of cool milk from the ice house behind the boarding house. The girl stared at the food for a long moment before picking up a slice of bread. She ate slowly, carefully, as if each bite might be her last. Martha recognized the behavior from her own experiences during the hard years after her husband's death, when food had been scarce and every meal was a small victory against starvation. "What should I call you?" Martha asked softly. "Do you remember your name from before?" The girl paused in her eating, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. Her green eyes grew distant, as if she were searching through memories that had been carefully buried. "They called me Little Wolf," she said finally. "But that was after. Before was—" She frowned, struggling with concepts that seemed to exist just beyond her reach. "Before was Sarah. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison." Martha felt her breath catch. Morrison. Captain Morrison had been the cavalry officer who found the girl. The coincidence seemed too great to be accidental. "Morrison," Martha repeated carefully. "Like Captain Morrison, the soldier who found you." The girl's eyes sharpened with an intelligence that was startling in its intensity. "Captain Morrison is my father," she said quietly, "but he doesn't know that yet." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. She stared at the child, her mind reeling with the implications. Captain Morrison had been the one questioning the girl, trying to get her to speak. If she was his daughter, why hadn't she revealed herself to him? "Sarah," Martha said gently, "if Captain Morrison is your father, why didn't you tell him? Why didn't you speak to him when he was trying to help you?" The girl, Sarah, set down her bread and wrapped her arms around her knees. "Because the Apache who raised me told me something before they died. They told me that my father was the one who ordered the attack on their village. They told me he was the one who had my mother killed." Martha felt the world shift beneath her feet. The story was becoming more complex and dangerous with each revelation. If Sarah Morrison was telling the truth, then Captain Morrison had unknowingly discovered his own daughter at the scene of a massacre that he might have ordered himself. "Sarah," Martha said carefully, "how long were you with the Apache? Do you remember when you were taken from your family?" The girl was quiet for so long that Martha began to think she would not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I wasn't taken," she said. "I was given to them by my father when I was 5 years old." The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. Martha felt her hands trembling as the full scope of the tragedy began to unfold in her mind. A father who had given away his own daughter, a child raised by enemies who had been taught to see that father as the source of all evil, and now a reunion that neither party recognized for what it was. "Why?" Martha asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Why would your father give you to the Apache?" Sarah's green eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. "Because my mother was Apache. Because when the troubles started, he had to choose between his career and his family. He chose his career." Martha closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the girl's pain as if it were her own. The story was heartbreaking in its complexity. A love affair between a cavalry officer and an Apache woman, a child caught between two worlds, and a father who had sacrificed his family to maintain his position in a society that would never have accepted his choice. "Sarah," Martha said gently, "your father may not have known what happened to you after you were given to the Apache. He may have spent every day of the past 7 years wondering if you were alive." The girl shook her head with the certainty of someone who had thought about this question for years. "If he cared, he would have looked for me. If he loved me, he would have chosen differently." Martha felt her heart breaking for this child who'd been forced to grow up too fast and understand too much about the cruelties of adult choices. Sarah's logic was flawless from a child's perspective, but Martha could see the larger picture that the girl was not yet mature enough to comprehend. Sometimes, Martha said carefully, people make choices that seem wrong from the outside, but make sense when you understand all the pressures they were facing. Maybe your father thought he was protecting you by letting the Apache raise you. Sarah's laugh was bitter, far too old and knowing for someone her age. Protecting me? Do you know what happened to the Apache who raised me? Do you know why they're all dead? Martha waited, sensing that the girl was finally ready to tell the truth about what had happened at the settlement. My Apache father, the man who took me in and treated me like his own daughter, was named Standing Bear. He was a war chief, but he wanted peace. He had been negotiating with the army, trying to find a way for his people to live without constant fighting. Sarah paused, her young face reflecting pain that no child should have to carry. 3 nights ago, soldiers came to our camp, but they weren't there to negotiate. They were there to kill everyone who might know about the peace talks. Someone in the army didn't want peace. Someone wanted the fighting to continue. Martha felt a chill of understanding. If Sarah was right, then the massacre at the Apache settlement had not been the result of renewed hostilities, but rather a deliberate attempt to prevent peace. The implications were staggering. "How did you survive?" Martha asked. "Standing Bear hid me in a cave above the camp when he heard the soldiers coming. He told me to stay hidden no matter what I heard, no matter what I saw. He said that if I was found, I should pretend to be traumatized and mute until I could find someone I trusted." The girl's survival strategy had been carefully planned and brilliantly executed. Her silence had not been the result of trauma, but rather a conscious choice to protect herself and the information she carried. "Sarah," Martha said, "if what you're telling me is true, then you're in great danger. If someone in the army ordered that massacre to prevent peace talks, they won't want any witnesses alive." The girl nodded solemnly. "That's why I couldn't tell my father who I was. If he's part of the group that ordered the attack, then revealing myself would have been suicide. If he's not part of it, then knowing who I am would put him in danger too." Martha marveled at the sophistication of the girl's reasoning. Sarah Morrison might be only 12 years old, but she had the strategic thinking of someone much older and more experienced in the harsh realities of survival. "So, why are you telling me?" Martha asked. "How do you know you can trust me?" Sarah looked around the kitchen, taking in the small details that Martha had used to make the space welcoming and warm. Her eyes lingered on a photograph on the wall, showing Martha with a man and a young boy, all 3 smiling at the camera with the easy joy of a family that had not yet learned to fear the future. "Because you lost your family to the Apache wars," Sarah said quietly. "Because you know what it feels like to have everything taken away by people who think they're doing the right thing. Because you're the only person I've met who might understand that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you most need protection from." Martha felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. The girl's assessment was painfully accurate. Martha had indeed lost her husband and son in an Apache raid, but she had also learned in the years since that the situation was far more complex than she had initially understood. The raid that killed her family had been in retaliation for broken promises and stolen land, part of a cycle of violence that had no clear beginning and no obvious solution. "What do you want to do?" Martha asked. "You can't stay hidden forever. Eventually, people are going to start asking questions about who you are and where you came from." Sarah considered this for a moment, her young face reflecting a gravity that was both impressive and heartbreaking. "I want to find out who ordered the attack on Standing Bear's camp," she said finally. "I want to know if my father was involved, and if he wasn't, I want to warn him that he's probably in danger too." Martha realized that she was being asked to help solve a conspiracy that could reach to the highest levels of the territorial government. It was a task that would require careful planning, absolute discretion, and probably a considerable amount of courage. "That's a dangerous path, Sarah," Martha said. "If you're right about what happened, then investigating could get us both killed." The girl met Martha's eyes with a directness that was startling in its intensity. "Maybe, but doing nothing will definitely get more people killed. The people who ordered that massacre won't stop with one Apache camp. They'll keep killing until they get what they want." Martha found herself nodding, despite the fear that was growing in her chest. The girl was right. If there was indeed a conspiracy within the army to prevent peace with the Apache tribes, then innocent people on both sides would continue to die until someone exposed the truth. "All right," Martha said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But we do this carefully. We trust no one completely. We verify everything we can, and we have an escape plan ready at all times." Sarah smiled for the first time since Martha had met her, and the expression transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. It was a smile that carried echoes of both her white and Apache heritage, combining the straightforward honesty of frontier life with the subtle wisdom of a people who had learned to read the truth in small signs and careful silences. "Thank you," Sarah said simply. Martha stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge. The town looked peaceful in the afternoon sun, but she now knew that appearance was deceptive. Somewhere in this community, or in the territorial capital, or in the army posts scattered across the desert, there were people who were willing to commit murder to prevent peace. "The first thing we need to do," Martha said, "is establish your cover story. People are going to be curious about you, and we need to give them an explanation that satisfies their curiosity without revealing who you really are." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately the importance of maintaining her disguise. "What should I be?" Martha thought for a moment, considering the various possibilities. The story needed to be believable, but not too interesting. Detailed enough to satisfy casual curiosity, but not so elaborate that it invited deeper investigation. "You're my niece," Martha said finally. "Your parents died of fever back in Missouri, and you've come to live with me. You've been traumatized by their deaths, which explains why you don't talk much. You've never been this far west before, which explains why everything seems strange to you." Sarah considered the story, testing it for weaknesses. "What about my name? Sarah Morrison is too dangerous." "Sarah Collins," Martha said without hesitation. "Collins was my maiden name. It gives us a family connection that people can verify if they're inclined to check." The girl nodded her approval. "Sarah Collins. I like it. It sounds safe." Over the next hour, they worked out the details of Sarah's new identity. Martha shared stories about Missouri, about the farm where she had grown up, about relatives who had died young or moved away. Sarah listened intently, memorizing details that might become important later. As the afternoon wore on, Martha found herself increasingly impressed by the girl's intelligence and adaptability. Sarah had clearly learned valuable survival skills during her years with the Apache, but she also retained the quick wit and curiosity that marked her as her father's daughter. The sound of horses in the street drew Martha's attention back to the window. Sheriff Bradley was returning, accompanied by two other men that Martha recognized as prominent citizens of Cedar Ridge. Behind them rode a small group of cavalry soldiers, led by the unmistakable figure of Captain Morrison. "Sarah," Martha said quietly, "your father is coming." The girl immediately tensed, her body shifting into the alert readiness that Martha was beginning to recognize as her natural response to potential danger. "What do I do?" Sarah asked. "You remember your story?" Martha said firmly. "You're Sarah Collins, my traumatized niece from Missouri. You don't recognize any of these men. You've never seen them before in your life." Sarah nodded, but Martha could see the conflict in her green eyes. The girl wanted desperately to reveal herself to her father, to end the years of separation and uncertainty, but she also understood that doing so might sign both their death warrants. Captain Morrison dismounted outside the boarding house with the practiced efficiency of a career cavalry officer. He was a tall man, lean and weathered by years of desert service, with graying hair and eyes the same startling green as his daughter's. There was something in his bearing that suggested he carried burdens beyond the normal responsibilities of military command. Martha opened the door before he could knock, stepping out onto the porch to meet the group of men. Sarah remained inside, positioned where she could hear the conversation but remain out of sight. "Mrs. Henley?" Captain Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "I understand you've taken in the child we found at the Apache settlement." "I have," Martha replied calmly. "She's resting now. The poor thing has been through quite an ordeal." "I'm sure she has," Morrison said, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that suggested he understood trauma firsthand. "I was hoping I might speak with her again. Perhaps she's recovered enough to answer a few questions about what happened." Martha studied the captain's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw was a man who appeared genuinely concerned about the welfare of a child, but she also noticed the tension in his posture and the way his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings for potential threats. "She still hasn't spoken much," Martha said carefully. "The shock of whatever she witnessed seems to have affected her deeply." One of the other men, whom Martha recognized as Judge Harrison from the territorial court, stepped forward. He was a portly man with the soft appearance of someone who had never faced real hardship, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a successful politician. "Mrs. Henley," Judge Harrison said, "I hope you understand the importance of this situation. That child may be the only witness to a massacre that could reignite the Apache Wars. We need to know what she saw." Martha felt her protective instincts flaring. She's just a child, Judge. Whatever she witnessed has clearly traumatized her severely. Pushing her too hard could damage her permanently. Sheriff Bradley intervened before the judge could respond. "Martha's right. The girl needs time to heal, but we also can't ignore the fact that she might have information that could prevent more violence." Captain Morrison was studying Martha's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. There was something in his expression that suggested he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "Mrs. Henley," Morrison said quietly, "may I ask how you came to take responsibility for the child? I know about your own losses in the Apache Wars. This can't be easy for you." The captain's question was astute and dangerous. Martha realized that he was testing her, trying to determine if there was more to the situation than appeared on the surface. "Sometimes," Martha said carefully, "helping someone else heal is the only way to heal yourself. That child needed someone who understood what she's been through. I've been through my own version of hell, Captain. Maybe that gives me something to offer her that others can't." Morrison nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Martha's face. "I'd like to see her, if that's possible, just for a moment. I won't question her if she's not ready, but I'd like to assure myself that she's being properly cared for." Martha felt a moment of panic. Allowing Morrison to see Sarah would be incredibly risky, but refusing might arouse suspicions that could be equally dangerous. "She's sleeping," Martha said, "but if you'd like to look in on her, I suppose that would be all right. Just please don't wake her. She's had very little rest since this ordeal began." Martha led the group of men into the boarding house, her heart pounding with anxiety. She had positioned Sarah in the small parlor off the main hallway, where she could appear to be sleeping while actually remaining alert to everything that was happening. The girl lay curled on the horsehair sofa, her face turned away from the door, her breathing slow and regular. To any observer, she appeared to be an exhausted child finally finding some peace after a terrible experience. Captain Morrison stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the small figure on the sofa. Martha watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition or unusual emotion. "Continue,"